Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello and welcome to Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Robert Jaquay. On today's show, we're going to be talking with Curtis Tucker, who is the General Director of the Lake George Opera at Saratoga. Let's go talk to Kurt and find out what a General Director does and how an opera company works. Kurt, I want to thank you very much for agreeing to be on the show today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start getting into the whole business of opera and Lake George Opera, I'd like to have you tell our guests about yourself and your background and how you came to Lake George Opera.
Okay, well, it was a bit of a circular path, I guess, but I'll try not to go too far back. I arrived at Lake George Opera in the summer of 2005, right in the middle of the heart of the summer season, so it was an exciting time to arrive. And I came here I was living down near Cincinnati in southern Ohio, where I was the general director of a company called Sorg Opera Company, which performed also in a small space and was the secondary company in Cincinnati. And so it had some similarities in terms of size and scope and all of those things. And I had been at Sorg Opera for 8 years and essentially just felt like it was time to move on. And Lake George Opera, this opportunity, again, without getting into too many of the details this opportunity came along, and it seemed like a fabulous not only company to be associated with in a beautiful area, and at a time when I was thinking about moving on anyway. So here I am. Getting to that point, I'll go back just a little bit more, though, as I have a little bit of an interesting background, and then I grew up in a musical family. I'm a musician at heart, I guess, and by training. Grew up in a musical family. My father played with Stan Kenton and was a big jazz guy, and my brother's a trombonist, and so it was sort of in the blood, I guess. But I started singing very early on, and there's something about singing and the voice really captured me, and so I sang, and that somehow led me to a couple of summer programs, and then ultimately a shift towards conducting. So I did a master's program in conducting, and I moved to California for what I now lovingly call my starving artist years, which were really filled with many wonderful things. When you're fresh out of school and making a go of it, though, it feels like the starving artist years. And I jumped coasts. I've moved around a little bit. I moved to Boston at that point and went to, of all things, law school. Oh, wow. And so did that period of time. I finished law school, got that degree. That's when I moved out to Ohio, jumped wholeheartedly back into the arts world and back into opera, and was out there for 8 years before here. So I'm a musician trained as a singer, conductor, who did a little sidebar through law school and has found himself in both artistic and administrative positions with opera companies, which, looking back at it, seems perfectly logical to me.
To you anyway, right?
Right.
How fascinating. Okay, so you've come to Lake George Opera, and this is an opera company that's been around for quite a while.
Quite a while. We're coming up on 46 years.
Okay. How about the history of the opera? I mean, I can go back a certain period of time, but I'm sure it predates me coming to the area. So how about giving some history for the opera company?
Well, sure. Well, we go back to 1962, and we go back to the shores of Lake George. Thus the name Lake George Opera, performing at Diamond Point. And it's interesting that we are Lake George Opera, although we really refer to ourselves generally as Lake George Opera at Saratoga now.
Okay.
I'll get to that momentarily. But we were at Lake George. We were at Lake George at Diamond Point really for only a very few years. A gentleman named Fred Patrick started the company, performed there, and it wasn't long before they were looking for a more permanent home in terms of a performance space. And they found themselves, we found ourselves moving down to Queensbury High School and settling with an office in Glens Falls. Performed for many, many years, more than 30 years at the auditorium at Queensbury High School. From time to time, as auditoriums need, there would be some renovations and we might find someplace else. Adirondack Community College. There were a couple of other temporary homes, but Queensbury auditorium was really our home until one of those years came around when the auditorium needed some work done in the summer, and we found ourselves looking for another space, and the Spa Little Theater in Saratoga Springs became the stop in 1998.
Okay.
And the first year at the Spa Little Theater went well, and we returned the next year. That next year, we also moved our administrative office down to Saratoga Springs, which was, of course, in this region, so much, there's so much cultural activity happening in Saratoga Springs with SPAC and the ballet and the orchestra and all of that. It seemed I wasn't here for that whole entire thought process, but there were a number of reasons to move down there. And even though it was really intended to be somewhat temporary, even at the time, this summer represents our 10th season, and we're still there. So it's become home.
It's hard to believe it's that long. I've enjoyed going there, by the way. I mean, I took the trip up to Queensbury, but it is a shorter trip. It's very accessible, and it's a nice intimate space.
Absolutely.
That does, though, create some artistic concerns or problems or challenges. Let's put it that way.
Challenges is a good word. The main issue is that there is no orchestra pit. And opera combines all the arts, as we know, singers and dancers and visual arts and orchestra. And there is no orchestra pit there, so our technical folks had to devise a way to make that work. And rather than having an orchestra between the audience and the stage in a lowered pit, which is normally the case, the audience and the stage and the action on the stage are really right there next to each other. It's almost like if you were at a thrust theater or Capitol Rep or someplace, and you're right there with the action, and the orchestra is behind the action. And because of their space needs and all of those, we have a couple of configurations. The orchestra can either be down essentially at the stage level, behind the scenery, usually with some visual through so that we can at least see that they're there. We want them to be part of the experience, certainly. Or we have a series of platforming that we put in there, and the orchestra is actually raised up on a loft, again, essentially behind the action. And that's where they're located. So the audience and the action, the drama, the singers are very close together, and it creates a real uniquely intimate opera theater experience. And so you might wonder, well, how do the singers see the conductor? Isn't that part of the deal? Well, it certainly is part of the deal. And basically just through cameras and monitors. There are 3 monitors placed out in the auditorium, and with a camera on the conductor, and generally the reverse as well, so that the conductor can see on a monitor back there see the stage. And it takes a little getting used to, and when we start our rehearsal process, everybody needs to know that that's where we're going to end up, because it's different than what they find in most
Clearly there's no prompters box there, right?
No, there's no prompters box. Whoever's sitting in the front row center, I guess, is the prompter.
Throw up a line or two. I know, when I first went there and saw the orchestra, I was questioning whether or not it would be effective, and I find it really very effective. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes you'll go to an opera, and you can go to a large house and have the orchestra overwhelm the sound on stage. And so I really find this works beautifully. So clever idea, and it works well. So
yes, thank you.
Now, you're the general manager.
Right, or general director.
Okay, okay. What does that mean?
Well, it means different things at different companies. At Lake George Opera, it has, though, a fairly standard meaning, and the general director in the opera world frequently wears both an administrative hat and an artistic hat. So we do not have a separate artistic director. So essentially, I am the artistic director. I'm involved in leading the process for opera selection, hiring the conductors and the directors and the artists and the designers, and just driving that artistic process. I'm also, as the administrative director or executive director, working with all of the other staff and the board with fundraising and marketing and all of the operational needs that it takes to support the artistic product. So I'm involved in both.
Do the whole show.
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully not. You certainly can't do it without a lot of other people, doing key things.
Now, how do you choose a season? How do you come up with the idea of what you're going to do in a year? And you have to do it. Do you do it just a year before, or do you do it a couple of years before?
It's about the process starts a couple of years before. I'd say about a year and a half before a season is when we will finalize that, firm it up. Our company is, the bigger the company, the further in advance typically that you're doing that, and which some artists in the big houses years out have their schedules set. We have a little more flexibility than that, but we're about a year and a half out in terms of the planning. And in our process, the procedure of it is that we have a program committee comprised mostly of board members, and we have a chair of that committee, and I work with that committee certainly, and he and I decide when we're going to get together and talk about repertoire and any other things we may have. And I will come with some recommendations. And generally, I'm given a fair amount of latitude. As the general director, as the artistic director, to sort of guide the process. Although there's certainly input from that program committee and from others in the community, perhaps. And I've always known that if there's something I want to do, and I go to that committee, and I am at the end of that meeting, if not everyone agrees that's what we should do, I know I need to think about it a little bit more and find, because but there are a lot of considerations that get talked about. Everything from the aesthetic and artistic notions in terms of messages and operas, and old operas versus new operas, and production styles, and all of those kinds of things, featuring a particular artist, those kinds of things sometimes factor into that, to absolutely very pragmatic concerns enter in. Budget, size of the cast, do we need an orchestra, or not an orchestra, do we need a chorus? What's the size of the orchestra that's needed? We perform in repertory, so we're opening one opera one night, the other opera the next night in a very small space, so our design has to work for the entire festival. And to think about an opera that happens entirely in an indoor, say refined kind of setting, to partner that with an opera that happens mostly outdoors in a rugged type of setting. We're in the business of being creative, so I like to think that we could actually handle any of those problems, but there's no need to make it unduly difficult, we figure. So, we try and find operas that are going to partner nicely.
So far, it's worked quite well. I'm impressed by how you could transform one into the other.
Right.
So you pick your season. Okay, now you have your standard repertory of operas to look at, the catalog of operas, but do opportunities come your way? I mean, I'm asking a question I already know the answer to, like last year, Our Town.
Right, absolutely. All those standard operas, all the opera companies are thinking about doing those. And maybe an opera that is a little unusual might come along. Last summer was a very unique opportunity that came along, and that was to be involved in the premiere, the commissioning of, and giving the professional premiere of Our Town by Ned Rorem. It was such a fantastic and unique project for, just a whole host of reasons. The play is, of course, quintessential American and very well known. The composer is not necessarily known as an opera composer, but one of the leading American composers for a long, long time, and composers for the voice, because he's written so many songs. He has been in residence many times at Yaddo, which is in Saratoga Springs, where we're performing, Ned Rorem. And so all of these combinations of things coming together, and it takes place in a little town in New Hampshire, which is not too awfully far from here. We can kind of
we can relate
with that. And so you add all of those things up, and then the cooperative effort. It was the result of Indiana University and North Carolina School for the Arts and Opera Boston and Aspen Opera Festival, Lake George Opera. A host of us coming together to make this project happen. It just had a lot of wonderful attributes about it. So that came into our season last year and really allowed us to expand our season. We'd been doing 2 operas every summer. We used that opportunity last year to do a 3-opera season, and I'm happy to say we're continuing with 3 operas this year.
And it seems like you're committed also to doing, we talked beforehand, and you said that you're committed to doing works by living living composers, right?
Well, that's right. Ned Rorem in our town became the first of a series of operas by living American composers. In 2007, we present Kirk Meacham's Tartuffe, which is, again, a popular, well-known, maybe not as well-known as our town, but Moliere's play is read in every college in the country, I think.
Sure.
And so it's a little bit based on that model of taking an established master work and then treating a relatively new operatic setting of it and bringing that to the stage. And Kirk Meacham, who lives in San Francisco, will be with us this summer at the opening of the production, and that's exciting. And I think as the years continue, we'll have more of those kinds of work.
I think it's wonderful to introduce to just opera goers or people who have gone there for the first time something different. I mean, we all love certain operas. I know that.
Right.
I sure do. But it's the adventure of going to see something and hear something new.
It's one of the challenges of doing 3 operas a year, let alone 2 operas a year, as it was before, is to really pique the interests of as wide a group of people as possible. And there are certainly many people that come to Lake George Opera that are opera aficionados. Some of them have been coming to Lake George Opera for all of its 46 years. Some of them are regulars at the Metropolitan Opera and Glimmerglass and some of the other companies. And they've seen about 200 more Carmens than they even wanted to. But they continue to come, and we love them for that. But at the same time, there are other people who haven't been to very many operas at all, are more likely to come when it's La Bohème or La Traviata or an opera that they've heard of, or there's been some connection, whether it's through Rent or a musical theater version of the story, or they've seen it in a movie, so we try and do as varied a program as we can, and it's challenging with only a few operas each year. So I'd like to think that each year we'll have some combination of established masterworks that are, everybody knows and loves and can almost sing along with, and then maybe explore a little bit. There are other companies that explore more than Lake George Opera does. I'll admit that right off, and unashamedly admit that we are relatively traditional in our approach. But even with that, we do have a history of premieres and new operas, and there was a time when Lake George Opera did a lot of new operas, and we've gotten away from that a little bit. We're bringing that back just a little bit with Our Town and Tartuffe.
Well, it's a risk. It really is. I mean, you want to have people come and fill the seats, but also enjoy themselves as well. Now, how do you get your information out? You have an educational program.
Yes, indeed.
And so that is developing young people's interest in association with opera.
Well, I think so, and I hope so. We have a program we call Opera to Go, and every year in the spring we bring 4 singers and a pianist, or however many are necessary, typically 4 singers and a pianist to town. We rehearse a children's opera, and then that tours to schools for 6 weeks. I have hopes that that's going to expand maybe to 7 or 8 weeks in the next year or two, touring throughout the entire region, north of Lake George, Albany, Schenectady, down in this area, over into Vermont a little bit, really quite a wide range. And that program now, in its current form, has been running for 7 years, and I'll say it's been extraordinarily successful. And most of the time we go perform in a school, and before we're even ready to think about scheduling next year, the schools are contacting us to say, when can we have you back? And you can't be much more pleased than that. But through that program, we reach about 20,000 children a year. We reach more people through that program, most of them children, than through everything else we do combined. And so I certainly hope that we inspire some of them, and at the very least we introduce the arts and opera to them. And doing it typically with a familiar story. This year's version was Little Red's Most Unusual Day, setting of Little Red Riding Hood, that used the music of Offenbach and Rossini to tell that story. And within the context of telling the Little Red story, there were also a number of sort of life lessons talked about. We hope we're also teaching children about good lessons, listening to your mother and not talking to strangers, and all of those kinds of things that are in there within the context of something fun. And And I'll tell you, I almost hate to say it on camera here, but I will say that it's wonderful to go to schools and see, because all of the children are always mesmerized. Some of the adults are not always mesmerized, I'll say. So getting in and introducing early to children, because this is really an elementary school age program, and it's wonderful to see the kids who have no preconceived notions about what opera is, or the myths that we hear so often about opera as being foreign or stuffy, or all of those things. Kids just, they're wide-eyed and open to it, and they always seem to love it.
And it's cool.
And it's cool, absolutely.
Now, is it strictly performance, or is there some interaction?
There is some interaction to it. Actually, every opera that we take has usually an opportunity for one or two of the kids to actually be in the production in some simple way. This is a program that tours to schools and performs and packs up and goes to the next school, and so we're not there for a long period of time in terms of a residency. But we always have at least a couple of the kids in the performance, and so they can see their peers up there on stage and that experience. And then at the end of every 45-minute performance, there's about 15 minutes of question-answer. Okay. So that's certainly interactive there. And we do those in the schools. We also do a few of those performances in some other public venues, libraries, and museums, and so forth.
Great. Now, we have young people who are learning about opera and eager to perhaps attend in the future, but you also have young artists. You have people who are aspiring to be, great perhaps, or just, established or have an opportunity to sing. So you have a young artist program.
We do have a young artist program. We have actually one of the oldest ones in the country. Lake George Opera, being older than many of the other opera companies around, started this program very early on in its history, and I believe the second oldest young artist training program in the country. And we call them young artists. They're really professional singers and artists, but they are bridging the gap from their academic study to the professional world. Now, understand that most of the singers, the end of their academic study is after they've completed undergraduate work, they've gone on and gotten a master's degree, and maybe they've done an artist diploma at a conservatory or something after that. So most of them are in their mid-late 20s, which is certainly still relatively young, but by that point, through both their academic scenarios and through other smaller companies and so forth, really are quite experienced in terms of their development.
So they're young in their careers.
They're young in their careers, and though talented, because many of them have gone on to really wonderful and fabulous careers. And while they're here with us, they get some training. They also perform in the operas. They perform a lot of the smaller roles in our productions. They sing in the chorus. But they do a lot of outreach into the community as well. And they're also featured in concerts. We kick off our summer season with Opera on the Lake up on Lake George every year, and they're featured in that program. They're featured in a variety of programs.
And they have on occasion returned as.
Absolutely, return as a principal artist. Right. And that's one of the most gratifying things in the business and in the process, I think, to see a singer coming along, starting out their career, and not as refined as an experience perhaps as some of the other principal artists, but you can see that talent blossoming, and they learn from the other artists that are perhaps more experienced, and then they come back, maybe sometimes very quickly, sometimes after several more years, come back as a principal artist. And to see that development, to have an opportunity to work with them and see them as they develop is extremely gratifying.
Now, is this a tuition on their part? I mean, do they pay to be involved, or is this a scholarship?
No, it's they're paid. We do pay them. Okay. We don't pay them a lot. They might think of them as stipends. Okay. Every company is a little different in terms of what it offers, and there are study training programs that are tuition based that singers pay to attend. But these singers in the apprentice program are really, most of them have generally gone beyond that point, and they're at companies where they're like I say, all these runouts and all the performances. They work hard while they're here, and we pay them a little bit, but they're largely here to gain the experience and build network and all those things they have to do.
Is it highly competitive?
Very competitive. In this past round of auditions, I had 560 applicants.
I should say.
And we ended up hearing just over, I think about 312, 320, something like that, live auditions. We heard them in Philadelphia, we heard them in New York City, and 12 of them were hired. 8 for the Apprentice Artist Program, which has been our standard. It's a little smaller program than at some of the other companies, and intentionally so. That way they all get a lot of individual attention and opportunities and so forth. We also have a sort of second tier young artist program called the Studio Artist Program. Those are mostly singers that are just finishing their undergraduate. So they are really young singers that are in the earlier stages of their training and don't have quite as much experience. But this gets them in the door, gets them an opportunity to see the professional setting as they're getting ready to go on for their graduate work. It gives them some great context for that.
I love when I go to other opera companies and look through their biographies and see their, where they've been before,
Right.
and or a familiar face too, looking on the board and seeing, he was here last year, or she was
Absolutely.
here last year. Okay, let's move on into the season that's coming up.
Okay.
We've already talked about a little bit of it.
Just a little bit. Well, 2007, we have 3 operas, and in 2007, the Spa Little Theater in Saratoga Springs is turned into Paris, France. Typically, when you come to the Spa Little Theater, I think about 2 years ago, for example, in 2005, we did the Mikado, which took us to Japan, and Italian Girl in Algiers, which took us to Algiers. So you come one night, you're in one setting, you come another night, you're in a different setting. And so we decided to shift that a little bit this year and say, let's just go to one place, but let's go to Paris in the 1800s, and let's go to Paris in the 20th century, and let's look at different looks of Paris. So all 3 operas that we're doing, Puccini's La Bohème, Offenbach's La Vie Parisienne, and Meacham's Tartuffe, all set in Paris. Very different styles, one's in French, one's in English, one's in Italian, all with projected titles. There's a lot of variety in the season, but it's all built around Paris, and there aren't many settings that are more beautiful than Paris.
So you can't miss with La Bohème, but the Offenbach, I've never seen it.
It's not done. It's done in France a lot. It's not done in this country a lot. It was done in Boston a few years ago, very successfully. It's an operetta. It's light. There'll be some dialogue. There'll be some singing. It's Bohème is the emotional pull of the season. Tartuffe is a classic comedy from the Molière play, and the Offenbach is. Some people think this is a derogatory term, but it's fluff. It's silly. It's fun. It's just a feel-good piece with beautiful, bubbly, bouncy music, and summer Saratoga that feels right.
Absolutely. Why not?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
So if someone's interested in going to the opera, the Lake George Opera at Saratoga, do they become a subscriber, or how do they go about?
Well, they can be a subscriber. A subscriber receives tickets to all 3 of the productions. There are some benefits of doing that. The earlier you get your tickets, the more choice in terms of seat selection you have. There's some price break by buying the whole series as a subscription. And but you can certainly buy single tickets as well. And single tickets right now can be purchased through the Lake George Opera office, the 518-584-6018.
Okay,
add that
we'll
number there.
project that, absolutely.
Okay, very good. There's some information on our website at lakegeorgeopera.org, and with ticket prices and all of those sorts of things. When we get a little closer to the season, the box office is handled through SPAC.
Okay.
And so you could go through their website or through their box office and get to us as well.
Okay. Now, if one wants to really get involved with Lake George Opera, they can become a friend of Lake George Opera, or do you have a guild also?
We do have a guild. It's called the Friends of Lake George Opera.
Okay.
It's a volunteer group, essentially our guild, and they help out with a variety of things. Some of it's help processing mailings, concessions at the performances, a number of the kinds of things that volunteers are involved with. Members of, we're like every other performing arts organization in that earned income from ticket sales is very important to us, but it is well less than half of the entire needed. We're about 25% actually from ticket sales in our small venue. So 75% comes from contributions from individuals and grants and corporations and fundraising events and all of those kinds of things. So there are whether it's as a charitable contribution as a donor or whether it's by attending special events. We have an opera ball every year. There's a big grand social event at the Gideon Putnam Hotel in Saratoga Springs. It's just a lovely evening with some singing and some food and auctions and all of those kinds of things. And so there's certainly lots of ways, regardless of what your interests are, there's ways to get involved.
Now, I went on the webpage and explored a little bit, and I saw that on one of the boxes it talks about being a member of, I believe it's a member, you can help me here, of Opera America. Now,
Right.
what is Opera America?
Opera America is a trade association, essentially. There is an association for each of the major arts groups. There's the American Symphony Orchestra League and Dance USA and Chorus America and so forth. Opera America is the organization for opera companies, and they have various kinds of memberships. There are individual memberships to Opera America. We are what's called a professional company member, which is sort of the highest stand. There's about 120 of us in the United States, I think, and it also includes Canada. And then there are some other memberships for some of the smaller groups and university groups and so forth. But it's a tremendous network, really, is what it is. I know colleagues all across the country. I have quick access to them. They do an annual conference that I go to every year, and they also gather data. They are sort of the mechanism for all of us to send information to a single source that then they can put into a report. They monitor the field nationally. To the extent there's a need to be involved with political discussions and all those sorts of things. They're involved with those things too. But so they provide a lot of services to the field.
So there's a lot of collaboration in terms of the field, and
there really is,
knowing each other and sharing with each other.
Absolutely, it's like any other field. Building network and having collaborative spirit is important, and especially in opera. There's so many people involved in opera.
We're at the end of the program, but before we close, I want to ask you if there's anything you want to restate or emphasize or share before we end the program.
Boy, we've covered a lot. I guess the one thing that I would end with is, what's unique about Lake George Opera at Saratoga, and I think the thing that's most unique about us is the intimacy that I mentioned before, the intimacy of the venue and the intimacy of the opera theater experience. Performing with very talented performers, so at a very high level, there's an intimacy that you get most of the time in a straight theater venue, but not necessarily in an opera venue. And we have great singers, but they have to be great actors in that setting. And it really is a unique experience that there are very few companies that equal it, I think. And I hope people will come see us.
Well, I think it's a terrific opera company, and I enjoy it, certainly. I know other people will too, and I congratulate you on your success. It's a top-notch company.
Thank you so much.
So thanks for coming today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining me on Getting to Know You. I hope you liked today's program. If you know me, you know I sure did. We'll see you next week. Until then, take care.